Mara had always been afraid of her own voice. Not in the way most people are, where a crowd makes them nervous or a spotlight makes their hands sweat. It was something deeper than that, something quieter. She was afraid that if she spoke too loudly, she would take up too much space. And Mara had spent most of her 24 years trying very hard not to take up any space at all. She lived at the edge of Greystone, a small mountain town in northern Montana that most people drove through without stopping. The kind of place where everyone knew your name but not your story. She rented a one-room cabin at the end of a dirt road behind a row of pine trees so thick that the cabin could not be seen from the main path. She had chosen it specifically for that reason. The landlord had thought she was strange. She had not argued with him. Every morning, she woke before the sun and walked the 2 miles to the bakery where she worked the early shift. Her job was to frost the cakes, arrange the bread loaves, and slide the muffin trays into the warm oven before the first customer arrived at 6. She was good at this. She did not need to speak much to do it, and the smell of warm bread made the silence feel comfortable rather than lonely. Her coworker was a woman named Donna, cheerful and loud, the sort of person who filled every room she entered. Donna talked constantly about her children, about the weather, about the strange car she had seen parked outside the diner. Mara listened. She nodded. She smiled at the right moments. She had become very skilled at listening, because listening required nothing from her in return. After her shift ended at noon, Mara walked home, cooked something simple, and spent the afternoon reading or sitting on the small porch with her cat, a gray-striped animal named Pip, who asked for nothing and gave warmth freely. She had found Pip behind the bakery dumpster 2 years ago, thin and shaking, and had carried him home inside her coat. He had never left. In the evenings, she walked the pine trails behind her cabin. This was her favorite part of the day. The trails were mostly empty after 5 o'clock, when the light started turning golden and the temperature dropped enough to keep casual hikers away. Mara liked the cold. It made everything feel honest. The trees did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. The wind did not apologize for its noise. She walked slowly, with her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, watching the light change through the branches above her. She had been walking the same trail for 11 months. She knew every route, every bend, every place where the creek crossed under a flat stone. She knew which section smelled like pine and which section smelled like wet earth. She knew that the deer came to the clearing at dusk and that the squirrels were noisiest near the old fallen oak. She did not know, on the evening of the 3rd of October, that something was already watching her from the tree line. She heard it before she saw it. A low sound, somewhere between a growl and a breath, coming from the dark space between 2 large firs, about 15 feet off the trail. Mara stopped walking. Her heart jumped hard in her chest, and she stood very still, the way she had read you were supposed to do. She did not run. She was not sure if that was bravery or simply that her legs had stopped working. Then she saw the shape of it. It was large, much larger than she had expected, with pale gray fur that caught what little light was left in the evening sky. Its eyes were amber, almost gold, fixed on her, with an intensity that felt less like hunger and more like judgment. It stood at the edge of the trees, with its weight on its front paws, head low, watching her the way something watches when it is deciding what kind of threat you are. Mara did not know much about wolves. She knew they had been reintroduced in Montana. She knew they generally avoided people. She knew all the rational things that the rational part of her brain was trying to tell her, and she could not hear any of them clearly because her pulse was very loud in her ears. What she did instead of any reasonable thing was crouch down. She lowered herself slowly, carefully, until she was on her knees on the cold dirt path, at eye level with the animal. She kept her hands visible, relaxed and open at her sides. She did not make any sudden movements. She did not speak at first. She simply looked back at the amber eyes and breathed as steadily as she could manage. The animal's head tilted, just slightly, a small movement, almost curious. "I'm not going to hurt you," Mara said softly. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. It always surprised her, the way her voice could sound calm when the rest of her was not. "I don't know where you came from," she continued, "and I'm not going to pretend I'm not scared, because I think you can probably smell that I am. But I'm not going to run. I just want to look at you for a minute, if that's all right." The animal did not move. Mara noticed, as her eyes adjusted, that it was not a wolf. Not exactly. It was too large to be a dog she had heard of, But there was something in the shape of its face, the slightly broader nose, the curve of the ear, that suggested something mixed rather than wild. A wolfhound, maybe, crossed with something she could not name. Its fur was matted in places, especially along its left shoulder, where a patch of fur had grown back differently, as though over an old wound. There were scratches along its muzzle, half-healed. It had been through something. She could see that clearly. Without thinking very carefully about whether it was wise, Mara reached into her jacket pocket. She always carried something from the bakery, a bread roll, a piece of plain muffin, anything left at the end of a tray. Today it was a small piece of plain flatbread, a little stiff and cold now from the evening air. She held it out in her palm, arm extended, making herself as small as possible. The animal's nostrils moved. It took one step forward. Then another, very slowly, like it was testing the ground between them, testing whether she would flinch or pull back. Mara held still. She kept breathing. She kept her eyes soft, not staring directly, just resting her gaze somewhere near, rather than fixed like a challenge. The animal came close enough that she could feel the heat of its breath against her palm. It took the bread. Mara let out a slow breath. Her hands were shaking now, just slightly, a delayed reaction to the fear she had been holding. But she also felt something else, something that did not have a clean name. A kind of warmth, a recognition maybe, of one careful creature meeting another. "There you go," she said quietly. "That wasn't so bad." The animal lifted its eyes to hers. Gold, steady, very direct. And Mara, without knowing why, without thinking it through, leaned forward and pressed a light kiss to the flat of its nose. It was a gentle thing, the sort of gesture that belonged to a child or a person with no sense of self-preservation. The animal went completely still under it. Not frightened, not aggressive, just still, the way something goes still when it is surprised into honesty. Mara pulled back and looked at it. "I'm going to call you Ghost," she said, "because that's what you looked like when I first saw you, standing in the trees like that." Ghost, and she had already decided that was his name, looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. No sound, no ceremony, just a slow disappearance back into the dark between the firs, until the gray of his fur was indistinguishable from the gray of the evening. Mara stayed kneeling in the dirt for a moment longer. Then she stood up, brushed off her knees, and walked home. She told Pip about it that evening, sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, while Pip ate his dinner and did not particularly react. "He was enormous," she said, "and I kissed him on the nose, which was probably the strangest thing I have done in at least a year." Pip finished his food and walked away. Mara laughed softly to herself. It was a quiet laugh, the kind she did not let anyone else hear, because it was the one that sounded genuinely happy rather than politely pleasant. She got up, washed her face, and went to bed. She left a bowl of water and a piece of bread at the edge of the tree line the next evening before her walk. She did not see Ghost that night, but when she passed the same spot on her way back, the bowl was empty and the bread was gone. She refilled the bowl without commenting on it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to leave food for a creature you had known for one evening and already trusted completely. By the end of that first week, she had bought a bag of dry kibble from the hardware store in town, the only place that carried pet supplies, and a second-hand metal bowl from the charity shop on the main street. She placed them both at the base of the large fir where she had first seen him. Ghost came back every evening after that. Not always immediately, not always close. Sometimes he only appeared at the edge of the light, watching her from a safe distance while she sat on a flat rock and talked, mostly about small things. The bread she had made that day, the argument she had overheard between two customers, the way the creek sounded different in the cold. Sometimes he came close enough to eat from the bowl while she sat nearby. Once, he lay down a few feet away and rested his head on his paws while she read aloud from a book she had brought. She never tried to touch him unless he came to her first. She never reached out unless his body language invited it. She understood, in the way that people who have been careful with their own trust understand, that trust was not something you could take. It was something that had to be offered, on its own schedule, when it was ready. Ghost seemed to understand the same thing about her. And somewhere in those quiet evenings, between the cold air and the pine smell and the sound of the creek running fast over its stones, Mara stopped thinking of herself as someone who was bad at connection. She had connected with something wild and wounded and afraid. She had done it without trying, without performing, without shrinking herself or pretending. She did not know, sitting on that flat rock in the October dark, that a man was standing 60 feet behind her in the trees, watching her with his dog. She did not know that he had been there every single evening. She did not know that he had seen the kiss on the nose and had not moved or breathed for almost 30 seconds after. She did not know any of it. She just thought she had found a stray wolf who needed someone to be patient with him. She had no way of knowing how right she was. The people of Greystone talked about Callum Hart the way people talk about a mountain. They respected it. They worked around it. They did not expect it to move for them. He had returned to Greystone 4 years ago, after his father passed, and left him the timber company that kept most of the county employed. He had not wanted to come back. He had been living in Seattle, working in property development, living the kind of ordered, contained life that suited him. He had not been happy, exactly, but he had been functional, and functional had felt like enough. Greystone had not been a return to something easier. It had been harder, in ways he had not expected. The land was familiar, but he was not the person who had grown up on it, and the town looked at him with a kind of cautious expectation he did not know how to satisfy. They wanted him to be his father, warm, loud, the sort of man who shook your hand and remembered your birthday. Callum was none of those things, and he had stopped pretending to try about 2 years in. He managed the company efficiently, he paid fair wages, he kept the operation solvent through a difficult period in the timber market, and never cut a single job during it. He showed up when he was needed. He did not show up when he was not. People in town had eventually settled into an understanding of him. He was not warm, but he was reliable. Not friendly, but fair. It was the kind of reputation that kept people at a comfortable distance, which was, if he was honest with himself, exactly how he preferred it. He was 32 years old. He lived in a large house on the mountain's edge, set back from the main road behind a gated drive and a line of old spruce trees. The house was clean, well kept, and almost entirely silent. He worked long hours. He cooked simple meals. He did not have many friends, in Greystone or anywhere else. The one thing he loved, without reservation or complication, was the dog. Ghost had come to him 3 years ago, left by a colleague who had bought him as a working animal and then found him too difficult to manage. Ghost had been aggressive then, or at least defensive, quick to growl, slow to trust, prone to long stretches of stillness where he watched everything around him with his amber eyes and gave nothing away. Callum had understood him immediately, in the bone-deep way you understand something that is built like you. He had not forced anything. He had simply been present. He had given Ghost space and food and time. And Ghost had eventually extended his own version of trust, slow, deliberate, never fully unconditional, but real. They spent most evenings together, and Callum had come to rely on those hours more than he admitted even to himself. He had started walking the pine trails with Ghost 6 months after bringing him home. At first, he went because Ghost needed the exercise and the space to run. Then he went because he needed it too. The trails were quiet in the evenings, mostly empty of people, and walking through the trees in the cold was the one time of day when Callum's mind stopped cataloging problems and simply rested. He had seen Mara for the first time on a Tuesday evening in late September, 5 days before Ghost had approached her. He had not been paying attention to the trail, lost in his own thoughts, and had nearly walked into her before he heard her footsteps and pulled back behind a tree at the bend. She had not seen him. She was walking slowly, head tilted back slightly, watching a pair of birds move through the upper branches of a tall pine. She had a worn canvas bag over one shoulder and her hands in her pockets, and she looked completely at ease with being alone in the middle of the woods at dusk. He had stayed behind the tree until she passed. Then he had continued his walk, and had not thought much more about her. But the next evening, he had noticed her again. Same trail, same quiet walk, same canvas bag. She stopped at the flat rock above the creek and sat down. She had a book. She read for a while, then set the book down and simply sat, watching the water. Ghost had strained at the lead. Callum had pulled him back. On the third evening, Ghost had gotten free. Callum had been looking the other way for less than a minute, adjusting his jacket against the cold, checking the time on his watch, And Ghost had slipped the lead with the particular determination he used when he wanted something badly enough. By the time Callum turned around, Ghost was already moving through the trees toward the trail. Callum had followed, far enough back to stay out of sight, close enough to intervene if he needed to. He had watched Ghost stop at the tree line. He had watched the woman on the trail go completely still. And then he had watched her do the thing that had made him go still too. She had crouched down, slowly, carefully, and she had stayed there. She had not run. She had not screamed. She had not tried to assert herself or back away carefully. She had simply gone down to Ghost's level and stayed. He had seen Ghost approach many people in the time they had been together. Ghost did not approach people. Ghost tolerated people, at best, when Callum required it of him. He had never, not once, walked toward a stranger voluntarily. He walked toward her. Callum stood in the trees and watched it happen, and felt something shift in the air that he could not name. Not danger, something else. Something more uncomfortable than danger, in its way. When she kissed Ghost on the nose, Callum did not move for a long moment. He watched her kneel in the dirt in the fading light, talking to his dog in a quiet, steady voice, and he felt a strange weight settle somewhere in his chest. It was not a dramatic feeling, it was quiet, the way the heaviest things often are, like the feeling of recognizing something true that you did not particularly want to be true. He walked home that night without calling Ghost back. Ghost found his own way home 2 hours later, unhurried and calm, and lay down by the door as if nothing unusual had happened. Callum made a decision that evening that he knew even at the time was not rational. He did not take Ghost back to that trail for 3 days. He told himself it was too much of a risk, that Ghost approaching strangers was a liability he could not afford. On the 4th day, Ghost sat at the back door and looked at him with the amber eyes for so long and with such stillness that Callum put his jacket on and walked him to the trail. He stayed further back that time, further in the trees. Ghost went to the flat rock where she was sitting, and she made a soft sound of recognition and delight that Callum could just barely hear from his position, and he watched her pull something from her jacket pocket and hold it out in her palm. He stood in the dark and watched his dog eat from her hand. He came back the next evening, and the one after that. He had told himself, those first 2 weeks, that he was only there to monitor Ghost, to make sure Ghost was safe, that the woman was not trying to lure him or trap him or cause any trouble. This was a reasonable explanation. He was good at reasonable explanations. But reasonable explanations do not account for the way he had started to look forward to the evenings. They do not account for the way he started arriving a little earlier, positioning himself with a clear line of sight to the flat rock. They do not account for the fact that he had begun to listen, really listen, to the things she said to Ghost in her quiet, even voice, the things that people only ever say out loud when they believe no one can hear them. She talked about the bakery, about Donna, her coworker, whose laugh she described as sounding like a seal, discovering something wonderful, about Pip, her cat, who she said was the most honest creature she had ever met because he never pretended to care about something he did not care about. She talked about loneliness in the offhand way that people talk about the weather, not with heaviness, not seeking pity, just naming it as a fact of her life that she had made a kind of peace with. "I'm not bad at being alone," she told Ghost one evening, while Ghost lay with his head resting on her knee. "I'm just not sure I was supposed to be alone this much. Does that make sense? Like I was built for something quieter than most people, but not this quiet." Callum leaned his back against a tree and looked up at the sky through the branches. He had not thought about himself in those terms before, but standing in the dark listening, he found himself thinking that he understood exactly what she meant, that he too was built for something quieter than most people expected of him, that he had arranged his life in a way that protected him from having to explain that. He did not tell Ghost to stop going to her. He followed every evening, and every evening, he stood a little further in the trees and felt a little more certain that he had made something very complicated for himself by not walking away when he had the first chance. He had known her name for about 10 days before they ever spoke. He had heard Donna say it, when she called from the bakery to ask Mara if she had taken the wrong apron home by mistake. He had been at the counter, picking up a coffee, and had heard Donna say the name and had filed it away without meaning to. Mara. He did not use it. He did not think of her by it, deliberately, the way you avoid the name of something you are trying not to think about too much. It did not help. On a Wednesday evening in the fourth week of October, he watched her sit in the light of a small battery lantern she had started bringing with her, reading aloud from a book while Ghost slept with his head in her lap. Her voice was low and steady and she read well, not performing the words, just letting them exist. The lantern made a circle of warm light around her, and Ghost in the dark of the trail, and Callum stood in the cold outside that circle and thought about how long it had been since anything had looked warm to him from the outside. He drove home too fast that night. He made himself dinner and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and told himself clearly, aloud, in the empty kitchen, that this could not continue, that he had made a habit of something that had no reasonable ending, that he was a 32-year-old man who was hiding in trees to be near a woman who did not know he existed, and that was not something he could sustain with his sense of himself intact. He was right about all of it. He went back the next evening anyway, and the one after that. Because the truth, which he was not quite ready to say aloud yet, was that those evenings in the trees were the only time all week when he felt like something other than the function he served. Not Callum Hart who ran the company, not the man the town kept at arm's length out of a kind of instinctive caution, not the person who had come back to a place that needed him and built a life around being needed rather than wanted. Just a man in the trees, in the cold, listening to a woman talk to his dog like Ghost was worth being honest with. He had not felt worth being honest with in a very long time, and he was not sure, yet, what to do with the fact that she was making him want to be. But there was something he had not counted on, something that had crept in quietly, the way the most important things do. He had started to feel responsible, not for Ghost and not for the trail, but for her, for the fact that she came to that rock every evening believing she was alone, and poured herself out with a kind of honesty she clearly kept in reserve everywhere else. He had been the witness to things she had not offered to anyone, and that made him something, whether he liked the word for it or not. He had also started to notice things he had not let himself notice in the first weeks. The way she pulled her left sleeve over her hand when she got cold, covering it before she reached into her bag, as if warmth was something to be conserved carefully. The way she always checked the bowl first before she sat down, making sure it was full before she did anything for herself. Small habits, the kind that reveal character without announcing it. He noticed that she laughed when Ghost sneezed, every time, as if it surprised her even after weeks of it. He noticed that she never left without saying goodbye to the trees, which she probably did not even realize she was doing, a small upward look, a half-formed gesture with one hand, as if the trail itself was something she was grateful to. He had told himself he was watching out for Ghost. He had stopped believing that explanation approximately 2 days into believing it. He knew, with a certainty that settled in him like cold water, that something was going to have to change. The question was not whether, it was only when. He had also, in those weeks of standing in the cold, arrived at an understanding of himself that he had not had before. He had always thought of his reserve as a kind of protection, a wall he had built deliberately, maintained carefully. But watching her on that flat rock, listening to her talk about the things that mattered to her most, he had understood for the first time that a wall which keeps everything out also keeps certain things in, that his silence was not only distance, it was also longing, compressed and careful, that had found no form until now. And whether when it did, he would have the courage to step out of the tree line. The cold came harder into Greystone in November, the way it always does in mountain towns. Not gradually, but decisively, like a door being shut. The ground hardened overnight. The creek slowed at its edges and went silver. Mara added an extra layer to her evening walks and bought a better pair of boots from the supply store, waterproof and lined, because the trail was soft in places where the frost had not yet settled and the mud got into everything. Ghost came every evening, without fail. She had stopped being surprised by this and had moved into something quieter, a comfortable expectation, the way you expect a particular chair to be in a particular place when you walk into a room you know well. She would arrive at the flat rock above the creek, set the lantern down, open the bag of kibble, and within a few minutes, Ghost would appear from the trees, unhurried and certain. She had started thinking of these evenings as the realest part of her day. The bakery was good. Donna was kind, in her loud and relentless way, and the smell of bread baking had never stopped comforting her. But there was a performance to it. To all the days, really, the careful calibration of exactly how much of herself to offer and how much to hold back. how to be pleasant without being open, how to smile in a way that said you were fine without inviting follow-up questions. Mara had been doing this for so long that it had become automatic, a second skin she put on with her jacket every morning. With Ghost, there was none of that. He did not require performance. He did not have expectations. He showed up, and she showed up, and the time between arrival and departure was whatever it was. Comfortable, quiet, occasionally strange in the way she sometimes said things aloud to him that she had never said to anyone. One evening in the second week of November, she told him about her mother. She had not intended to. She had been talking about the bread she had baked that morning, a sourdough that had risen perfectly, and then cracked too fast in the oven, and somehow that had led her to talking about the kitchen in the house where she grew up, and then to her mother standing at the stove, and then to the fact that her mother had died 4 years ago, and she still sometimes reached for her phone to call her before remembering. Ghost was lying beside her on the flat rock, his large head resting on her thigh, his eyes half closed. He did not move or respond to the change in her tone. He simply stayed where he was, heavy and warm and present. "She would have liked you," Mara said. She had no fear of anything large. She used to say that big things are mostly just more of the same thing, and there's no use being afraid of more of something you already know. She ran her fingers through the fur along Ghost's neck. "I don't know if that's true, but I think about it sometimes when I'm scared." Ghost exhaled slowly through his nose. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." She had not cried. She had not felt the need to. She had simply said the things and let them sit in the cold air, and that had been enough. There was something about Ghost's particular quality of listening, his absolute stillness, his complete absence of response in the conventional sense, that made her feel heard in a way she could not explain. He offered nothing back. He made no sounds of sympathy. He did not try to fix the sadness or reframe it or reassure her. He just stayed. She thought, sitting on the flat rock in the lantern light, that she had been trying to find that from people for most of her life. The willingness to simply stay, to not run from the harder things or try to smooth them into something easier. She had not expected to find it in a dog. She had not expected a lot of things that had turned out to be true. In the mornings at the bakery, she found herself distracted in small ways. She burned the edge of a tray of shortbread one Thursday because she had been standing at the window watching a man cross the street who had dark hair and a certain way of walking, and it had taken her a full 3 seconds to confirm it was not who she had briefly thought it might be. She had not examined why that mattered. She was better than most people at not examining things that would make her uncomfortable. Donna noticed, because Donna noticed everything. "You're somewhere else this morning," Donna said on a Friday, pulling a tray of cinnamon rolls from the rack. "I'm right here," Mara said. "Physically," Donna agreed, and left it there in the way that experienced observers leave things, not pushing, just naming, letting you decide what to do with the naming. Mara did not do anything with it. She finished the frosting on the lemon loaves and thought about the evening ahead, and the flat rock, and the sound the creek made in the cold. She had started bringing better things for Ghost. Not just the leftover bread or the kibble from the bag, but actual effort. She had looked up what was safe for large dogs and made a plain chicken and rice mixture twice a week that she kept in a sealed container in her bag. She told herself it was because a dog that size needed good food, not because she had started to think of his health as something she was personally responsible for. She told herself that. 3 days later, the pipe under the bakery sink burst. It happened at 6:15 in the morning, before the first customer arrived, when Mara was sliding the first tray of rolls into the oven and Donna was mixing the batter for the morning muffins. The sound was a low groan from under the counter, and then a hiss, and then water began spreading across the old linoleum floor with a steady determination. Donna said something loud and indelicate. Mara turned the oven down, moved the tray to the top rack, and opened the cabinet under the sink to find the shutoff valve. The water stopped. The damage was already done. A section of pipe had separated at a joint, old metal finally giving out after a decade of cold winters, and the cabinet under the counter was soaked through, and the floor was wet nearly to the door. The landlord was a man named Barry, who lived 2 streets away, and picked up his phone on the 5th ring. He said he would come by. He came by an hour later, looked at the pipe, looked at the floor, and said that the building's plumbing was managed under a maintenance contract held by the property company, and it was out of his hands. He would call them the property company, Donna informed Mara while they mopped the floor and served customers through the serving window with no access to the back sink, was Hart property and timber, which meant, she said, with the certainty of someone who had lived in Greystone all her life, that it would either be dealt with very quickly or not at all, because that was how Callum Hart operated. Either he showed up or he sent someone, and either way it was done properly. Mara had heard the name. She knew, in the vague way you know things about a town you live at the edge of, that Callum Harta owned most of the commercial properties in Greystone and employed a significant portion of the county. She had seen his name on a sign near the timber yard on the main road. She had heard Donna mention him once or twice, usually in the context of something being repaired or improved or quietly resolved. She had no particular feeling about him. He was a name attached to a function, the way most people in positions like his are, until they are not. He arrived at 11:30 that morning. Mara was at the counter when the door opened, and she looked up the way she always did, automatically, neutrally, braced for any kind of customer, and saw a tall man in a dark jacket come through the door and pause to take in the room. He was not what she would have called remarkable to look at, not in the way that announces itself. He was lean, with brown hair worn short, and eyes that were a particular shade of dark gray, and he had the quality of stillness that Mara had always associated with people who did not feel the need to fill a room with noise in order to exist in it. He looked at the counter. He looked at the wet floor, which they had mostly dried, but which still had a damp stripe near the window. He looked at the cabinet under the sink, which was propped open. Then he looked at her. "Mara?" he said. She blinked. "Yes? I'm Callum Hart." Barry called the maintenance line. He moved behind the counter when she nodded him through, crouched beside the open cabinet, and looked at the pipe. He had a small flashlight from his jacket pocket, which he used without fuss. He did not say much while he looked. He asked her one or two questions about when it had happened and what the water pressure had been like in the weeks before, and she answered them as accurately as she could. Then he stood up and said, "We can get someone in tomorrow morning. First thing. I can have a temporary fix done this afternoon so you have use of the sink. I'm sorry for the disruption." He said it like he meant it, not the way people say sorry when it is a formality. He said it with a particular directness, like someone who said what he meant because not saying it would be a waste of both their time. Mara found herself saying, "Do you want a coffee while you're here?" She had not planned to say it. It came out before she had considered it. The automatic hospitality of someone who had worked in a food shop long enough that offering people things was reflex. He paused. Just briefly, "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She made it from the machine behind the counter, the good one that did a proper espresso. She asked about sugar. She had a policy of asking, because she had learned that people had strong opinions about it, and when she did, he said yes. "Just the one," he said. She handed him the cup. He thanked her. He stood at the counter and drank it while she restocked the pastry case, and he did not fill the silence with unnecessary words, which she found she appreciated more than she would have expected. She caught herself looking at his hands once, large, with a particular kind of steadiness to them, the way a person's hands are when they spend time outdoors, and looked away before he looked up. When he finished, he set the cup down and said, "Someone will be here at 4. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He left. Donna appeared from the back with an expression of barely contained interest. "Well," she said. "The pipe will be fixed at 4, Mara said, and went back to the pastry case. Donna watched her for a moment. He stayed for coffee. He was being polite. "He does not stay for coffee. I have lived in this town for 51 years. Callum Hart does not stay for coffee." Mara looked up at her. He had a long drive. Donna made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, and went back to her muffins. The plumber arrived at 4, exactly as promised. The pipe was replaced and the cabinet was dried, and by the following morning, the bakery was fully operational. Mara wrote a short note of thanks and left it with Barry to pass on, because she did not have another way to send it, and she thought that was probably the end of it. She thought about it later that evening, sitting on the flat rock with Ghost's head on her knee, more than she expected to. "I met someone today," she told Ghost. I just met him. He fixed our pipe. But he was strange." Ghost opened one eye. "Strange in a good way. Quiet. Like he had decided not to use more words than were necessary, and I find that kind of person hard to read." She paused. Actually, I find most people hard to read. Maybe that's not a useful thing to say. She scratched behind Ghost's ear. He had gray eyes. Really gray. The kind that look like they've seen a lot of weather. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Ghost closed his eye again. She did not know why she was telling him either, except that Ghost had become the place where things she had not fully understood yet found a shape. He was patient with half-formed thoughts in a way that people, in her experience, generally were not. She went home later than usual that night, because the sky above the trail had gone very clear, and the stars were the kind of bright that only happens in high-altitude cold, and she stood with her head tilted back and looked at them until her neck ached. She felt restless in a way she could not explain. Not unhappy, just like something had been put slightly off-center, the way a picture on a wall shifts after you've walked past it quickly, and you know it is different even if you cannot quite see the change. She had not asked his name. She had already known it, from Donna. But he had offered it anyway, which she had found, in retrospect, a little formal and a little endearing in the same breath. She got into bed and turned the lamp off, and lay in the dark listening to Pip settle beside her knees. She did not think about him again. She told herself she did not, but she found the note she had written to Barry the next morning, sitting on the kitchen counter where she had left it, and she stood looking at it for a moment before she picked it up. It was a plain enough note. Polite, professional. She read it over once and then, without entirely deciding to, she added one line at the bottom. The coffee was good company on a cold morning. She folded it back up and took it to Barry's house on her way to work, and she did not think about it again after that. She told herself she did not. 4 days passed, then 5. The bakery was back to normal. Donna brought in a new variety of cinnamon for the rolls, and the whole shop smelled different for a week, spicier and a little sharper. A regular customer who had been coming in every weekday for 3 years finally told Mara his name was Owen, which he offered without particular reason, as if they had simply reached the point in a friendship where names were finally appropriate. She liked that. She thought it said something about how trust worked. Not an event, just a moment when you realize you have already arrived somewhere you were heading all along. She was thinking about trust and how it moved, not in straight lines but in circles, coming back around when you least expected it, when she saw a familiar truck parked outside the feed store on the main road. She almost walked past it. Then she stopped. It was the same dark blue truck she had seen parked in front of the bakery the morning Callum had come about the pipe. She was fairly certain of that. She stood on the pavement for a moment, not sure why she had stopped, and then she kept walking, because stopping was not something she had a reason to explain. But she thought about it that evening on the trail, with the lantern lit, and Ghost's head on her knee, and the creek running its steady cold conversation beneath them. She had not expected to recognize his truck. She had not been paying that kind of attention. Or she had thought she had not been paying that kind of attention, and the recognition had corrected her. There was something about the correction that she needed to sit with for a while. She did not have a word for what she was feeling, exactly. It was not the big feelings she had been trained by stories and songs to expect. No rushing certainty, no sudden clarity, no dramatic internal shift. It was smaller than all of that. More like an adjustment. Like when you have been listening to a song played slightly flat for so long that you stop noticing, and then someone plays it in the right key, and the whole thing settles into place so simply that you think, yes, that is what it was supposed to sound like. She was not sure she was ready for that. She was not sure ready was even the right question. Ghost sneezed, and she laughed, and the evening continued, and the creek kept running, and she was thinking about trust, and how it moved when she arrived at the flat rock and opened her bag, and she was still thinking about it an hour later when she walked home under a sky that had gone dark and very clear. She was thinking about that, actually, on the evening that everything changed. She was reading when he walked out of the trees. She had been sitting on the flat rock for about 40 minutes, the lantern set beside her left knee, Ghost lying against her right side with his flank warm against her leg. The book was one she had read before. A travel memoir about a woman who had walked the length of Iceland, and she had reached a passage about crossing a lava field at night that she remembered being moved by the first time. She was reading it again slowly, letting the words settle. Then Ghost lifted his head. It was the way he moved when he heard something he recognized, not alert and sharp the way he went when it was a stranger, but an easy lift, like a person looking up when they hear a familiar name. He was looking toward the tree line to her left, and Mara, following his gaze, looked too. The figure that came out of the trees was tall, moving through the last of the light, with a careful, unhurried step. For a moment, she could not make sense of what she was seeing. A person, on her trail, in the dark, coming from the wrong direction. She got to her feet quickly, the book falling off her knee. Then the lantern light reached his face. She stood very still. Callum Hart stopped about 8 feet from the edge of the rock. He was in a dark jacket, the same one from the bakery, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that she had thought about more than she had intended to, and he said nothing for a moment. Ghost got up from beside her, walked to him, and sat down at his feet with a calm and proprietary ease that made no sense to Mara at all until it did, until every piece of it rearranged itself in the span of one breath into the only shape that fit. She looked at Ghost. She looked at Callum. She looked at Ghost again. "That's your dog," she said. He did not look away from her. "Yes." She sat back down on the rock because her legs had made a decision about this before the rest of her had caught up. She put her hands in her lap. She was aware that her heart was doing something unsteady in her chest, though she was not sure yet whether it was anger or something else. "How long?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just, she thought, choosing the true answer over the convenient one. "Since the first night." She let that sit for a moment. Since the first night, since the night she had knelt in the dirt and kissed a stranger's dog on the nose and talked about not wanting to scare him. Since every evening after. Every conversation she had had sitting on this rock, alone, talking to Ghost, thinking no one was listening. Someone had been listening. She felt the heat of it, not embarrassment exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular discomfort of having been seen doing something true without knowing you had an audience. "You were in the trees," she said. "Yes." "Every evening?" He met her eyes. "Most of them." "And Ghost? You let him come to me. You kept letting him come back." He looked down at Ghost, who was watching him with calm amber eyes, apparently unconcerned with the nature of this conversation. The first time he got free by accident. After that, he stopped. He looked back at her. "I told myself I was monitoring the situation, making sure it was safe." Was that true? Another pause. For the first few days, Mara looked at him. At the careful way he was standing, the way he had positioned himself slightly back from the rock, not pressing forward, giving her space in the same deliberate way that Ghost always had. She thought about what she had told Ghost over those weeks, about her mother, about the loneliness she had made a kind of peace with, about the gray-eyed man from the bakery who had been strange in a way she found hard to explain. "I talked about you," she said, to him, after we met at the bakery. Something moved in his expression, very small. "I know," he said quietly. The weight of that landed differently now. She had said things to Ghost that she would not have said if she had known there was a person in the trees, 60 feet away, listening through the cold and the dark. She had said things she had barely said to herself, and he had heard them, all of them, and had kept coming back. She thought about standing up and walking away. She thought about asking him to leave. She turned both possibilities over, and held them, and found that they did not feel right. Not because she was not upset, but because she was also something else. She was, and this surprised her, curious. The way you are curious about something that makes no sense, and that you want to understand, before you dismiss it. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you keep coming back? Why not just walk up to me? Or call Ghost home? Why stand in the trees?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because when I was out there, I wasn't anyone in particular. I wasn't Callum Hart who runs the company. I wasn't the person this town looks at and keeps at a certain distance because it doesn't quite know what to do with me. I was just present, in the trees. And I hadn't been that in a long time." She studied his face. He was not performing this. She could tell. She had spent enough of her life reading the space between what people said and what they meant to recognize when someone was speaking, without the layer of careful management she usually encountered. "He meant it." "That's a strange thing to do," she said. "I know. It's also..." She stopped. She was going to say something she was not sure she wanted to say, And then she said it anyway, because she had always respected honesty more than comfort. It's also a little bit something I understand. He looked at her. Existing somewhere that you don't have to be your full self, she said, just to have a break from it. I do that too. Not in trees, but this. She gestured at the trail, the rock, the lantern. This is where I come to not perform anything. I know, he said again, and this time the words landed differently, because they meant, I have been here while you were not performing. I have seen that version of you, and I came back. She sat with that for a moment. The lantern between them cast a low, warm light across the rock, and somewhere in the dark below them, the creek moved over its stones with the same indifferent constancy it had always had, regardless of who sat above it or what they admitted to each other. She thought about her mother, who had said that big things are mostly just more of the same thing. She thought about what a strange and true idea that was, because this, whatever this was, this man standing at the edge of the rock with the truth still warm in his mouth, was not entirely unfamiliar. It was more of something she had been learning slowly for months, without knowing she was learning it. More of the same patient presence she had found in Ghost. More of the same honest stillness. Just with words now, and a face, and gray eyes that had seen all of it. She thought about whether she was angry. She examined the feeling carefully, the way she examined most feelings, without drama, without rushing the conclusion. She found something in there. Something that was related to anger, but was not quite anger. More like the feeling of discovering that a conversation you thought was private was overheard. It was not comfortable. But neither was it the sharp, clear thing that anger was supposed to feel like. It was softer, more ambiguous. She thought about all the evenings, the way Ghost had been there every time, steady and unhurried. The way she had felt, sitting on the flat rock, that she was being truly heard for the first time in years. She had assumed it was the dog, but it had been both of them this whole time. The dog and the man behind the dog, together making up a kind of audience that had, in its particular strange silence, been the first audience she had ever felt safe in front of. That was not nothing. She looked at Callum and thought about what it would have taken to come out of the trees, to give up the shelter of invisibility and stand on the trail in the light and say what he was. She thought about the courage that required, of a particular kind, not the loud courage that announces itself, but the quiet kind that costs you the protection you have been relying on. He had done it anyway. How long were you going to wait? She asked. He looked at her directly. Until I could not justify it any more to myself. And when was that? Tonight, he said simply. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. All right. She was quiet for a moment. So now what? He looked uncertain, in a way that she suspected did not come naturally to him. I wanted to tell you the truth before he stopped. I didn't want you to find out some other way. Did you think I was going to find out? I thought I was going to have to walk up to you eventually, because I could not keep doing this and maintain any reasonable opinion of myself. Something in her chest loosened. She was not sure whether it was the honesty or the phrasing of it, the particular dry precision of it, which was the most self-aware thing she had heard anyone say in a long time. She looked at Ghost, who had lain back down now, and was watching them both with the peaceful patience of an animal that had, as far as he was concerned, done everything he was supposed to do. He came back every night, she said, even when you weren't here. He went on his own a few times. That's not nothing, she said. He doesn't do things he doesn't want to do. I could tell that about him pretty quickly. Callum looked at his dog with something quiet in his expression. No, he doesn't. Which means he wanted to be here. Yes. And you kept following him. He looked at her. Yes. She stood up from the rock, slowly, and picked up the lantern and her bag. Ghost rose immediately and moved to her side, which made her look down at him and feel a complicated warmth that she could not entirely explain. She understood now why he was so steady. He had always known exactly who he belonged to, and he had chosen to divide that knowledge between two people without asking either of them for permission. Animals, she thought, had a particular kind of wisdom that operated without explanation. I'm going to walk home now, she said. I need to think. Callum nodded. He made no move to stop her or follow her. Are you going to be strange about it? She asked. If I happen to see you in town? No. Good. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. She started walking, then she stopped. She turned around. He was standing at the edge of the rock, watching her, and he looked. She found the word before she could stop herself. Lost. Not helpless, not dramatic, just the particular look of a person standing at the edge of something they do not know the shape of, hoping they have not ruined it entirely. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the small piece of flatbread she had brought for Ghost. Pip had knocked the rest off the counter that morning and eaten most of it, which was his own kind of editorial comment on the situation, and she walked back and held it out in her palm, the way she had held it out the first night. Open hand, arm extended, patient. Callum looked at her hand and then at her face. Take it, she said. You look like you need it more than him right now. He took the bread. He held it with the expression of someone who had not expected kindness and was not entirely sure what to do with it, the expression of a person who has built so many walls to keep things out that they have also accidentally kept certain things in. She recognized it. She had worn it herself. She watched him hold it for a moment. Just a small piece of cold flatbread, nothing significant. But there was something about the act of taking it that had required something from him. She could see that. He had come to the trail with a truth that had cost him something to carry for as long as he had carried it, and he had set it down in front of her, and she had responded not with anger or with warmth, but with something more precise than either. An offering. The same kind of offering she had made the night they met, without knowing he was the person on the other side of it. She had always believed that patience was the quietest form of courage. Standing here in the lantern light on the trail that had been hers alone for 11 months, she thought she was beginning to believe something slightly different. That the quietest form of courage might actually be honesty. The willingness to stand in the open, without the shelter of your walls, and say the true thing, even when the true thing makes you smaller and less defended than you were before you said it. He had done that. She had not decided yet what she wanted to do with it, but she had decided, at some point between sitting on the rock and reaching into her pocket, that whatever she did with it would be honest. I'm Mara, she said, as if they were meeting for the first time. As if the last 20 minutes had been a different conversation, one that did not count, and this was the real start. He looked up at her. Callum, he said. She nodded. I'll think about it, she said. About all of it. She walked home. This time, she did not stop. The morning after was hard in the way that honest mornings often are. Mara woke early, earlier than usual, before Pip had even decided to claim her ankles, and lay in the dark listening to the wind move through the pines outside her window, thinking. She had not decided anything yet. She was honest enough with herself to know that deciding anything before she had properly turned it over would be a mistake, and she was also honest enough to admit that there was something she could not quite dismiss. Not the strangeness of what he had done, which she could not dismiss either, but something underneath the strangeness. Something that refused to resolve itself into either outrage or indifference, no matter how long she held it. He had stood in the trees. He had stood in the trees for weeks, not because he was trying to take anything from her, but because he was trying to exist somewhere that did not require him to be the version of himself the world had assigned him. He had followed his dog to her and then kept following, because the evenings in the cold, hidden, unannounced, had been the only time he felt present, not performing, not functioning. She understood that, completely. That was what made it complicated. She got up, made tea, sat at the kitchen table with Pip on the chair beside her, and thought about it for a long time. About what it meant to be seen without knowing you were being seen. About whether that was a violation or something else. Something more ambiguous, more difficult to categorize. About the difference between watching and witnessing. Watching was a kind of taking. But witnessing, staying, returning, being changed by what you heard without using it, that was something different. She was not sure she had a word for it that fit cleanly. She thought about the way Ghost had walked to him when he came out of the trees. The ease of it, the belonging. She thought about the way Callum had stood back from the rock, giving her space, not pressing forward. She thought about the bread. She thought about all the evenings she had sat on that flat rock believing she was speaking into empty air, and how the empty air had, in fact, been a man in the cold, learning her by listening rather than by asking. Most people, in her experience, learned you by asking, and the asking was often less about curiosity than about wanting to feel they had done the work of knowing you. Callum had done a stranger thing. He had waited. He had simply been present in the way that Ghost was present, without agenda, without pressing for anything in return. She was not sure what to call someone who had done that. She was not sure the word existed yet. She got up and put the kettle on and leaned against the kitchen counter while the water heated, listening to the small sounds of the morning, the wind outside, Pip rearranging himself on the chair, the slow tick of the radiator. These were the sounds of her life as she had built it. Small, controlled, comfortable, quiet. A life she had shaped carefully around the fact that she did not trust easily, and around the hope that not trusting easily was a reasonable thing rather than a loss. She thought about Owen, the regular customer who had finally offered his name after 3 years. She thought about the creek, which ran in the same direction whether or not anyone was watching. She thought about her mother standing at the stove, adding more of something because more was not always frightening. It was sometimes just more. She went to work. She thought about his voice when he said, "I told myself I was monitoring the situation." She almost smiled at the kitchen table. She did not quite. She went to work. She frosted the cakes and arranged the bread and slid the muffin trays into the oven and listened to Donna talk about her sister's daughter, who had gotten into nursing school and was moving to Billings. She smiled at the right moments, and she meant the smiles, which she thought was probably progress, the difference between performing attention and actually giving it. There was a particular morning light that came into the bakery in late November, pale gold and slanted, that hit the top row of bread loaves at about 8 o'clock and made them look like something worth painting. She had noticed it every year since she started working there, and had never mentioned it to anyone. Today she mentioned it to Donna, pointing at the loaves and saying, "Look at that." Donna looked. "Oh," she said, "that's lovely." It was. Mara smiled again. She meant that one too. She smiled at the right moments. She worked the counter. She said goodbye to the last customer at 2, and walked home and changed into her trail boots. She did not decide to go to the trail. She just found herself walking there, which she had come to understand was how her best decisions were usually made, not through reasoning, but through the body simply moving in the direction of the true thing. Ghost was already at the flat rock. He must have been there a while. He was lying with his chin on his paws, and when she appeared, he lifted his head, but did not get up, with the patience of an animal that had been waiting without anxiety because he had simply known she would come. She sat down beside him. She did not bring the lantern. The evening was clear, and the moonlight was strong enough to see by. "He told me," she said to Ghost, "about all of it." Ghost put his head back on his paws. "He said it was so he could exist somewhere without being Callum Hart, whoever that is, which is..." She paused. "I don't know what that is exactly. I know what he looks like a little. I know he fixes pipes on time, and drinks coffee with sugar, and says fewer words than strictly necessary. I don't know what he carries around." She looked up at the sky. "But then, I didn't know what you carried around either, when I first met you. You were scarred and matted, and you stood there in the trees, like you were ready for the world to disappoint you. And I stayed anyway." The wind moved through the pines above them. The creek ran steadily somewhere below. She had spent almost 3 months on this trail, believing it was her private place, her retreat from the day, her honest space. And now she knew it had been something else as well. A place where she had been seen, carefully, by someone who came back every time, and kept the seeing to himself. She sat with that knowledge, and waited to see what she felt. She did not feel invaded. That was the unexpected part. She heard footsteps from the direction of the trailhead. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself the moment. Then she looked. Callum was walking down the path with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he stopped when he saw her, about 10 feet away. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had made a decision, and was living with the weight of it, the particular posture of someone who has chosen honesty over safety, and is standing in the space between the two, waiting to see what it costs. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure either," she said. He came and stood at the edge of the rock, not sitting, just there. Ghost lifted his head, looked at him, looked at Mara, and settled back down with the serene indifference of an animal that had done his part and considered his work complete. "I owe you more than an explanation," Callum said. "I know that. What does more look like?" He thought about that with the seriousness she had already come to expect from him. "I don't know yet. That depends on you, I think. On what you want." She looked at him. "That's an honest thing to say." "I've been trying to be honest. I think I've been not very good at it, in general, for a long time, but I would like to be. With me. Yes. She shifted on the rock and made room beside her. Not pressuring, not inviting exactly, just adjusting the space, leaving a gap. He sat down after a moment, not close, but on the same rock. Ghost got up, turned in a small circle, and lay back down between them, his body warm and solid and bridging the gap. They sat for a while without speaking. The wind moved the pine branches overhead, and the creek ran over its stones, and the moonlight was very bright and clean on the trail. She looked at his profile in the moonlight. The straight line of his nose, the angle of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders. Not relaxed exactly, but not armored either. In between. Like someone who had put the armor down but had not yet decided where to set it, so was still holding it loosely just in case. She knew that position. She had held it for years. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The note I left, the one I gave Barry for you, did you get it?" He looked at her. "Yes." "Did you read it?" "Yes." "The part at the end," she said. "The line I added. Did you understand what it meant?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought I did. I wasn't sure." She nodded slowly. "I wasn't either. When I wrote it, I mean. I wasn't entirely sure what I was saying, but I think I was saying—" She stopped. She tried again. "I think I was saying that the silence between us felt comfortable, and that comfortable silence is something I don't find easily." "Neither do I," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell. You finished your coffee and you didn't perform anything. Most people perform something when they're in a room they're not sure about." He looked at her. "So do you." "Not that day?" "Not that day." She thought about that. "Because of Ghost," she said. With Ghost, I had already gotten used to not performing, and then you walked in, and you were quiet in the same way, and I think I just forgot." He was very still beside her. "You forgot to put the second skin on," he said. He said it quietly, not as if he was drawing attention to something, but as if he simply recognized it. She looked at him sharply. "That's what you called it," he said. "In one of the evenings, you were talking to Ghost, and you said it was a second skin you put on with your jacket every morning." She had said that. She had said exactly that, on a cold evening in late October, when she had been talking about the bakery, about how she had learned to navigate other people so carefully that she sometimes could not feel the navigation anymore. She had said it to a dog on a trail in the dark. She had not thought anyone heard. "You were listening," she said. "Yes." To all of it. "Yes." She let out a slow breath. It was strange, she thought, being known by someone who had not been given permission to know you. And yet, he had not used it. He had not come to her at the bakery with her own words as leverage, had not tried to appear wiser or more intimate than he was. He had carried what he knew quietly, and then he had come to the trail and told her the truth, which was the only thing she had ever really asked of anyone. "You know," she said eventually, "I kissed your dog on the nose the first night I met him." "I know," Callum said. "I was there." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with those gray eyes, steady and open, in a way she suspected cost him something, and she thought about everything she had said on this trail over the last 6 weeks, to an animal she had not known belonged to someone, never knowing she was also saying it to him. She thought about her mother, and the loneliness, and the sourdough that cracked in the oven. She thought about all the truest things she had let herself say, because she had believed no one was there to hear them. And she thought, he heard them, all of them, and he came back. She reached up and pressed her thumb, very lightly, to the bridge of his nose. It was a small gesture, quick, almost gentle enough to be accidental. The same gesture she had made to Ghost the first night. Not romantic, not grand, just a touch, a recognition, a thing that said, "I see you. I am not afraid of you. I am going to try." He went very still under it. She dropped her hand. "Mara," he said. Just her name, quietly. "I know," she said. She looked back at the trail, the light on the water, the dark shape of the trees. "I'm not saying it's not complicated. I'm not saying I've made up my mind about what this is or what it becomes. I'm not asking for that. I'm saying," she found the words slowly, carefully, the way she found the right words when they mattered. I'm saying I understand why you did it, and I'm not sure I could have let you in through the front door, the way I let you in through the trees. I'm not sure that version of me would have been real enough. He was quiet. The kind of quiet that is not absence, but attention. So I'm not saying it's fine, she continued. I'm saying it's strange, and I'm choosing to look at the strange thing honestly, rather than simply away from it, because that's the only way I know how to do anything. He nodded. That's more than I deserved. Probably. Ghost sighed deeply and sprawled his full weight across both their feet. Mara looked down at him. A sound came out of her. A small, genuine laugh. The kind she did not usually let anyone hear. The private one. The one that sounded actually happy. Callum looked at her when she laughed. She caught him looking, and she did not look away, and he did not either. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no music in it. It was quiet, and imperfect, and cold, and entirely real. Come back tomorrow, she said. Not from the trees, from the trail, like a person. All right. And bring him, she nodded at Ghost, because he was here first. He was, Callum agreed. She got up, picked up her bag, and without thinking about it first, clipped the small spare lead she had started keeping in her bag to Ghost's collar out of habit. She looked at it, and at Ghost, and then at Callum, and handed the lead to him. His hand closed around it, warm against her fingers for a moment. She let go. She walked home. She did not look back, but she was smiling. That quiet, private smile that sounded like it was genuinely happy rather than politely pleasant, and she kept it all the way to her front door, where Pip was sitting in the window, watching her return, with the mild interest of an animal who had long ago decided she was worth waiting for. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She stood in the warm kitchen and thought, there it is. That is what it feels like. Not a performance, not a careful calibration, just a man and a dog and a flat rock in the moonlight, and the particular warmth of being chosen by something that does not choose easily. She had not gone looking for it. She had only been walking her trail, being honest, being herself, in the quiet hours when no one was supposed to be watching. But someone had been watching. Someone had listened to the truest parts of her and had kept coming back, not because it was convenient or easy, but because once you have heard someone speak without their second skin on, you cannot unhear it. It changes the shape of you. It makes you want to be the kind of person they would speak to like that again. She had spent 24 years being afraid of her own voice, afraid of taking up too much space, afraid that if she was too fully herself, the world would find her to be too small or too strange or too quiet. And a dog had walked out of the trees one October evening, and a man had followed it, and somewhere between the cold and the lantern light and the flat rock above the creek, she had said every true thing she knew how to say, and not one word of it had been too much. Sometimes, she was beginning to believe this now, and to believe it without conditions. Sometimes the truest things find you not when you are ready, or searching, or brave in all the ways you think bravery is supposed to look, but when you are simply showing up, quietly, on the same path you have always walked, being as honest as you know how to be. And something in the trees, something careful, something that has been watching and waiting, and learning whether you are the kind of person who stays, finally decides to step into the light.